Let's walk through the cluster stitches that we're going to use in our Juni throw with our May instructions. Now we did the cluster stitches before, pull up here. We did the cluster stitches before in our January instructions. So we have a return of them again in May, but they're made in a different place. So instead of made along the peaks that we did in January, we're going to make our cluster stitches in the valleys, which means we're not going to chain one between the cluster stitches. We're instead going to be skipping stitches when we make them. So I've just started, I've got my beginning, and I've just finished the peak stitches. So my first cluster is going to go into this first stitch right here. And just to review, yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop. Now I've got 7 loops on my hook, and I'm going to yarn over and pull through all 7. So now instead of doing any sort of chains between them, I'm going to skip the next stitch, and I'm going to cluster in this stitch here. So hook, 1, yarn over, pull up a loop, 2, yarn over, pull up a loop, 3, yarn over, and pull through. And I'm going to do this 6 times until I have my entire valley of the ripple finished. 3, yarn over and pull through, and I have 2 more left to make. Skip this one, I'm going in here, 1, 2, 3, and then my last one, skip this one, so I'm going to go here, 1, 2, 3. And count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Got my 6 clusters here, and you can see that makes the valley. So that's how we make our cluster stitches to make the valley of our May instructions. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this row, and then we're going to talk about making the single crochets in the next row into these stitches. So now that I have my row complete with my clusters in the valley of my ripple, I'm going to do my single crochet row, which we're told to single crochet in every stitch in every chain 1 space. Now remember back in January when we did the clusters and the chain 1 spaces, it was a little difficult to see what was a chain 1 space and what was the cluster. When we're right in the valley, that's not very difficult to see because each of those clusters has a nice big long top of the stitch that we can work into. But when we get to these chain spaces that are between the double crochet in the first cluster and the last cluster and the next double crochet, it gets a little funky. So we're going to use the same technique that we did before, and you can use a stitch marker, you could use your hook. So this would be the top of, or this would be when I finish my cluster, this would be the stitch or the loop that's still on my hook, which means that the top of this first cluster is actually right here. So I'm going to work, if my yarn will cooperate, there we go. Now chain 1 space, the space itself is pretty obvious, it's right there. So I'm going to work my single crochet into that chain 1 space, and you can see how when I work that single crochet, it kind of encroaches over that top of that stitch. That's because that's the actual chain. So then the top of this cluster is actually right here. And remember, we do 6 single crochets in our valleys and then 11 up in our peaks. So I'm going to work 6 single crochets. There's the first one. 1. There's the next one. 2. 3, and like I said, those are really easy to see because they're much bigger. 4 and 5. Now I want you to take a look at this last one. This one's a little difficult to see because we do that chain one and then we do the cluster, the top of the cluster, the stitch, gets a little cinched. So it looks a little bit smaller. So we kind of have to, you should be able to kind of work your hook into that, but if you can't, just give it a little tug. Get your hook in there. And once you work your hook into it, you'll see like, oh, okay, there's space there. And we do our single crochet. So that's our 6 single crochet in the valley of our ripple in our May pattern. And then we're able to do the rest of our single crochets in our chain one spaces and in the tops of our stitches. Happy crocheting!